Good day. I'm hoping that you're all doing very well. I want to thank Father Mel for his invitation to share in this day of recollection with you, to be able to reflect with you on the Strena for 2020, which is Good Christians, Upright Citizens. Really feels as though this was an important thing for us to do as we spend time in recollection, especially at this time of year. The choice of the Strena for 2020 really seems to have been prescient on the part of the Rector Major. And it seems that 2020 has just been an incredible year for us. So many unexpected twists and turns. The world is upside down. Our bearings are disoriented. Fear and chaos and some confusion are reigning in many parts of the world, and perhaps even in our own hearts and in our own communities, even in our own lives. Faith and commitment to the common good are the two forces that can help us reestablish stability, and the Strena stresses both for us as members of the Salesian family. We know that Don Bosco often spoke of this idea of the young becoming good Christians and honest citizens, upright citizens. There were a variety of forms that it was given over the course of the years when Don Bosco would try to educate the young. And it reminds us, and it was a reminder to the young, that we are citizens of two worlds. And we need to be committed to developing all of the character and principles that are needed to be worthy citizens of both. And so faith and involvement in everyday human life are extremely important for us. And we show that by the communities that we are involved in, of which we are citizens, participants, members. I think if we're going to begin to reflect together on the Strena and this theme that the Rector Major has proposed for us, I think the first place to start is with ourselves. To look at our own lives, our own experience, our education, our ethnic background, our culture, and to consider the ways that we consider what we're being asked to do when we are asked to form good Christians and upright citizens. And what are the lenses that I use in order to be able to communicate these ideals to the young? What dominates in the way that I'm going to try to prepare to present these themes to those that I've been entrusted with in ministry? We have to learn how to avoid having our politics dictate our theology. Instead, it should be our theology that guides our politics. And I think that the Rector Major, Don Bosco himself, were able to see this very, very clearly, that without the faith-based actions and principles that we have, we will not be able to be good citizens. We will not be able to be engaged in politics in an authentic way. We have to really think, and I think a good part for us to start at on this day of recollection is for us to consider the ways that we in community, or we as individuals, speak about politics, about sports, about TV shows, about songs, video games, YouTube clips, anything that comes across, our table, our office, that makes us, it takes up a lot of our time, and that we frequently speak about with one another, knowing all the details of so many, many things, and then compare and contrast that with the amount of time that we start talking about theology, philosophy, spirituality, papal encyclicals, any of the documents that have been provided by our SDB leadership, the documents of General Chapter 20, the documents that are coming out afterwards, proposing to us to be able to be animators of the entire Salesian family. How many of them become just books that are put onto a shelf, yet another document that is very nice for other people to read, but perhaps not for ourselves. And I think that we need to also define the terms that we've been asked to convey. What does it mean for me, as an individual, to form a good Christian? What is a good Christian? What am I trying to form? And what do I consider to be characteristic of what it means to be a great disciple of Christ. And then what does it mean to be an upright citizen? And as I said before, our experience, our education, our ethnic and cultural background will be the lens very often that we use to interpret those two questions, and it will determine the way that we're going to educate the young and those that we are called to minister to in becoming good citizens and also good Christians. At the end of it all, as we're doing this, we enter into dialogue. Dialogue with those that we've been entrusted, those who have been entrusted to our cares, and an ability to listen with an open mind and an open heart, to be able to hear truly what it is that someone else is saying, rather than prepare our rebut or our response to what is being said. Now, as we're in the midst of a pandemic, responding to the call to help young people become good citizens and good Christians and upright citizens has been difficult. First of all, we're not in contact with them in the ways that we once were. And Zoom meetings, as useful as those can be, are not the same thing as being in contact and forming a community. And it's very much, we have to form good Christians and upright citizens in community, not simply in isolation from one another. And the difficulty of conveying these two messages is exacerbated by the fact that we're not only dealing with a physically infectious and dangerous disease, something that we really do not fully understand at this particular time, we're also suffering from an even more insidious virus that is attacking the moral fiber of individuals and societies. Pope Francis, in Fratelli Tutti, describes this as empty individualism, a narrow and violent nationalism, xenophobia and contempt, and even the mistreatment of those who are different, and a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference. Very strong words from Pope Francis, and yet something that has been a theme, or themes that he has spoken about throughout his pontificate, and also during the time when he was a cardinal and archbishop in Argentina. Pope Francis called out the every man for himself worldview that will rapidly degenerate into a free-for-all that would prove worse than any pandemic. And he noted that the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly erupted when he was writing Fratelli Tutti. But he used the presence of the virus to critique a world unable to resolve problems that affect us all. This has led to a strategy of ridicule, suspicion, and relentless criticism, rather than seeking a solution to this worldwide pandemic. So we get distracted. You know, in the old days, in the British, they talked about the dead cat. And you'd throw a dead cat into the middle of the table in the conference room where you were, so that everyone would be talking about the dead cat rather than the issues that needed to be held at hand. We get distracted. We throw out the things that become illusory in order to be able to avoid having to deal with the substantial issues of our days. There really is an urgent need for good Christians to speak up, for honest citizens to be engaged, and for our political leaders to lead. And that time to do that is now. We're called to advance a worldview that stresses the communitarian dimension of life and values fraternity and social friendship. God willing, after all this, we'll no longer think in terms of them and those, but only us. We really need to be prophetic if we're going to lead people to be good Christians and upright citizens. Being willing to challenge the status quo, being willing to speak out even when it's uncomfortable for us and for others. And even as some of the things that we would try to say and do would be misinterpreted by others. Many of us remember Dom Helder Camara, who at one point, he was very known for working with the poor and those people living in poverty and who are disenfranchised, marginalized. And at one point he reflected on the way that he was perceived by many people. And at one point he simply said, "When I fed the poor, they called me a saint. When I asked why they were poor, they called me a communist. They couldn't accept that someone who would want to help those who were in bad straits would also want to know, how do we prevent this from happening? We also know that Don Bosco, even in his own time, when he tried to be able to address the issues of the young who were imprisoned, the people that were living on the streets, kids who were caught in petty thievery, he wanted to know what he could do to be able to help them. And even the local clergy began to believe that he was crazy and tried to put him into the asylum. The possibility of being misinterpreted as we become prophetic voices in our society and in our communities is real. However, it should not prevent us from being prophetic voices. It's what we're called to do. To be able to be prophetic, we have to begin with prayerful contemplation. Prayerful contemplation, in general, to be able to be one with God, to be able to hear His voice speaking to us in the depths of our being, but also prayerful contemplation of the context in which we find ourselves in. So even in the province, and in the provinces throughout the congregation, the context is very different. And we know that we have to respond in light of the context that we are in. Because we need to start there in order to be able to say, and how should we be able to participate politically? In some countries where society is a little less structured or effective than we would consider our own government and our own society to be, they've begun people's parliaments and children's parliaments in which the local community decides what needs to be done to be able to transform their society. And they start to do things in order to be able to meet, to speak with one another, to address the issues, and then come up with communitarian-based solutions. Because very often the government, the local leaders, are not addressing the things that are most important for them. That sort of approach of involving everyone to be able to have voice and to participate is something that we need to do, no matter what our context is. The foundation of our civic engagement and asking others to become involved civically is recognizing the dignity of all human beings, no exceptions, each one of whom is created in the image of God and bears the face of Christ. We need to look at the way that from the moment of their conception until their natural death and all stages in between, everyone shares in a common human dignity. We've heard it used or expressed, this sort of thing, in the way that has been used by certain theologies, see, judge, act. We've also seen that within the congregation, both in our preparations for the general chapter and then in the post-chapter reflections, we were asked to recognize, interpret, and choose. That's the way that we need to go around. We have to recognize where we are, interpret that situation and how we are to respond to it and how God is calling us to respond to it, and make choices that are extremely dedicated to be able to respond to those needs. I was quite moved at one point when one of the provinces in Mexico saw we were told to look for the new frontiers. And one of the confreres in that particular province saw that some of the people that were most disenfranchised, most marginalized, were young people who were now incapacitated as a result of an accident, and they were either confined to bed or they were wheelchair bound. Some of the ones that were confined to bed, if they were given the opportunity to have a wheelchair, would have been able to do that. And that province committed itself, the new frontier for them was to take care of those who've been traumatized by injury and need to be able to become integrated members of a society. And so, Don Bosco sobre Ruedas was founded, and now is assisting people to live independent lives, to fully participate in life, believing that God has not abandoned them, but instead is still present to them and loves them and cares for them and is watching over them, and that He wants now for them to take what they have learned and pay it forward. Instead, what we're finding very often, instead of responding, in very, very prophetic and kind ways, we find that political diatribes are beginning to dominate the way that we are even in community sometimes. Political life is no longer seen as something that is open to healthy debates about long-term plans to improve people's lives and to advance the common good, but only with slick marketing techniques primarily aimed at discrediting others. Those are the words of Pope Francis, rather strong, to be able to say, what are we doing? And in this craven exchange of charges and countercharges, debate degenerates into a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. That is not what a good Christian does. That's not what an upright citizen does. It's engagement to be able to promote something larger than oneself and one's self-interest. But we become attached. We become attached to a way of life, a way of thinking, a way of acting. And really, one prominent source of attachment that can really slow us down in being able to be prophetic is that we still need to confront is our own individual political opinions, especially in this polarized era. Let's face it, most of our elections are 50% and 50%. Half of the people are in favor, the other half don't like it, or 48%, 48%. It's very, very rare that we're going to get a great majority of people going there. This can happen in community as well, even in the midst of the Salesian family. We can be so committed to our biases that recent studies have shown that individual political ideologies often shape their moral framework instead of the other way around. The opposite of what our faith demands, what we're called to as consecrated religious, as members of the Salesian family. Our challenge is to let the teaching of the Church, our faith, the gospel, the person of Christ himself, to be the light by which we organize our politics and our involvement in the political field and in the political world. That was said by Bishop Daniel Flores of Brownsville, Texas, when he was asked about the topic of politics. That interview happened at the beginning of February, just last February, 2020. We have to be involved in a society, but the gospel has to be the principal lens through which we judge things. But sometimes, and we aren't always conscious of it, we allow our politics to be the lens by which we judge the gospel. And I think that's one of the sources of the division within the body of the church. We judge the gospel by our political views. We can begin to believe that Christ is too idealistic to ask us to live the Beatitudes, to be living witnesses to his love, his compassion, his reconciliation. And yet, that is contrary to what we say we believe. Detachment in political conversations and participation means being open to the possibility that someone we disagree with at the start might be right, or that the whole truth might not lie in a single party's or a single candidate's platform. Pope Francis offered during a 2013 homily, "Good Catholics meddle in politics, offering the best of themselves so that those who govern can govern." Politics, according to the social doctrine of the Church, is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. I cannot wash my hands, eh? We all have to give something. And the art of compromise doesn't mean that one person totally changes their position, but it says it looks for the truth that can be able to say that we have now found something that will do the best amount of good for the greatest number of people. We find that very challenging at this particular moment. And as Christians, we need to respond to the reality that over the course of the last 3 years, the number of Americans who say that they feel justified in using violence to achieve their political goals has risen from 8% to 33%. That's the context that we're living in at this particular moment, that people are beginning to see that violence is the only way to solve differences of opinion, or because they want to be able to achieve a particular goal, a particular ideal. It's something that as Christians, we need to be able to confront. St. John Paul II, in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, said it this way, that we must be involved. By virtue of our sharing in Christ's royal mission, our support and promotion of human life must be accomplished through the service of charity, which finds expression in personal witness, various forms of volunteer work, social activity, and political commitment. That's paragraph number 87. Their shared vision of politics as a worthwhile good reflects Catholic teachings on the essential role of governments at every level to protect human dignity and to promote the well-being of all. Plus, Pope Francis and his predecessors have worked with a broad definition of politics which transcends partisan brawling. Instead, they are referring to the ways that local, national, and even global communities come together to make decisions about their shared life. The pandemic is one of the most important issues that we need to cooperate with multilaterally across nations, because the virus has crossed every border in the world. And blaming or looking for the blaming for people and not responding to the needs that have arisen is really not very Christian. We need to discern. And real discernment requires that we nurture our relationship with Christ in that deepest part of ourself where God resides. It's not about imposing our views on others, but about collaborating to learn more about God's hopes for our world and how best to live those out, in the humility that we cannot do it alone. Now, we talk about rugged individualism as being an American trait, but a rugged individualism that simply runs ripshod over others is really not individualism, it's selfishness. We need to acknowledge that there have always been divisions. We look at the early beginnings of the church. There were people that aligned themselves with one or the other person, who wanted to be able to follow Christ or not follow Christ, who didn't like what they heard, they walked away. But we read in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 4 to 6, "For when one says, 'I follow Paul,' and another, 'I follow Apollos,' are we not mere human beings? What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow." Once we align ourselves only with a particular individual, a particular party, a particular ideology, we forget to see what the end goal is and how God wants to work through each of those individuals. And so even within our provinces, we can think of the people who were the early founders of the province and how things over the course of decades, even centuries, have allowed us to continue to grow, to see the mission of Don Bosco continue to expand. Some would want to say that they're simply following Don Bosco, but I really like Don Rua better, or I liked Rinaldi better, or I liked, whoever we decide is the most important person in the way that we live out our spirituality. We can have an affinity for someone or the way that they led and going through, or we can say also that everyone had their part to play in the growth and the thriving of the community. And it was all because it was God's work. Don Bosco reminded us of that often. And sometimes there's divisions because of practical instances within the community. We read in Acts 6, verse 1, "In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food." We compete with one another. We start to point to the other as someone who doesn't deserve what they're getting. You're not giving me as much as they're getting, and causes great divisions. Instead of saying, how do we go about to make certain that everyone's needs are being taken care of? If we're going to form good Christians and we're going to be able to form upright citizens, we need to help people form their consciences. And we need to help them have informed consciences. And there's a great debate among us that will say, this is what a good conscience is, and that's what a good conscience is. And that's, once again, going back to what is my experience, what is my formation, what is my spirituality, and to believe that I only know the right way to be able to know what God's will is for me. I'm the only one that can determine what is good, what is evil. We need to really work in ourselves first to know that we are truly informed about what it means to be in good conscience. Cardinal Bernardin spoke of a consistent ethic of life that allowed us to see that we are a seamless garment, that all the pieces matter, and that all of us are called to make certain that the whole stays together rather than put tears and holes into the garment that is the church. So I'd like to conclude this part of the reflections and leave you with a couple questions and go back to the very first things I asked. What is a good Christian for you? What is a good citizen, an upright citizen for you? What is a good conscience? What is the common good? What principles are most important for me, guide me in the way that I make my decisions, both in my spiritual life and in my political life? If you have time and the opportunity, perhaps you can share that with one or two other people or in a small group, just to see the variety of answers that we will all come up with while we're all trying to build up the body of Christ and helping the young to come closer to God. Thank you very much.